This morning, a state of emergency across California as massive amounts of rain drench the West.
They're going somewhere.
2 minutes ago, something shifted beneath the United States. In normally stable regions, the ground is splitting and cutting through farmland with no storms, no earthquakes, or warning. Above it, flocks of birds suddenly turn back mid-flight, moving in perfect unison as if responding to something unseen. Then the earth itself begins to fail. Sinkholes open beneath Pennsylvania neighborhoods where families had felt secure for decades, forcing them to evacuate without tremors or warning. Now even the rivers are changing white foam, stretching for miles as fish rise silently. These events are not isolated. They are arriving together. And the question is no longer if something is unfolding, but why it is happening now. If you're willing to look beyond the surface and connect what others overlook, like, subscribe, and stay with us. In recent weeks, unusual changes have been reported along parts of the California. Residents began noticing long, straight cracks appearing across hardened ground, clean lines cutting through open land. These cracks were not jagged or chaotic. They appeared as clean lines, running parallel for hundreds of meters, dividing fields and empty lots with unsettling precision. What made these fissures disturbing was not just where they appeared, but their timing. They did not follow known fault lines. There were no earthquakes recorded overnight, no storms, no flooding. In several cases, tire tracks and footprints from the previous day ended abruptly at the edge of a new crack, as if the land had shifted quietly while everything else slept. Unlike drought-related cracks that branch and curl as moisture evaporates unevenly, these lines advanced forward, straight and deliberate. Local officials and geologists offered familiar explanations: long-term groundwater depletion, subsidence, gradual pressure building beneath the surface. The processes were known. The language was technical, yet the timing remained difficult to account for. Similar cracks are appearing across regions with different soil compositions and climates. People living near these areas described a shared response. There was no panic, no crowds. Often, it was just one or two individuals stopping their cars, stepping out, and standing silently for several minutes. The ground did not look violently damaged. It looked altered, separated, as if something below had shifted without warning or sound. Scripture often uses this image when speaking of warning and exposure. Collapse rarely begins with noise. Foundations weaken first. They separate before they fall. The prophet Isaiah warned of a land breaking apart quietly, writing, "The earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken." Yet before the violent shaking comes separation, what appears firm begins to give way beneath the surface. That is why these fractures feel different from ordinary geological events. They are not disasters. They have not destroyed homes or taken lives. Instead, they reveal change. They show that something once whole is no longer unified. The question, then, is not whether the ground can crack. That has always happened. The deeper question is why this kind of precise separation is appearing now quietly, across multiple regions, without a dramatic trigger, and whether the division visible in the land reflects an instability that has already begun beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. As the ground below continued to separate in silence, another disturbance appeared overhead. Along parts of the Los Angeles and into western San Francisco, people began reporting flocks of birds abruptly changing direction mid-flight. The shift was sudden, nearly a full reversal, and it happened in unison. The birds did not scatter or cry out. They stayed tightly grouped, turning together as if responding to something ahead that could not be seen. There were no storm systems developing offshore. The sky was pale and open, broken only by thin streaks of cloud. Commercial flights moved steadily across the horizon. Nothing visible explained why entire flocks would abandon their course at the same instant. People watching from the grounds described a quiet discomfort, not fear, but a sense that something was off. The sky looked ordinary, yet the movement within it was not. The moment felt linked to what had already been unfolding below. The land had not broken apart with force. It had separated quietly, almost carefully. Now, the birds did not flee in confusion. They simply turned away. Yet the change was unmistakable. In the Bible, animals are often shown responding before humans understand what is coming. In the Old Testament, the prophet Jeremiah observed that even animals recognize approaching change sooner than people do. Even the stork in the heavens knows her appointed times, and the turtle-dove swallow and crane keep the time of their coming. But my people know not the judgment of the Lord. Jeremiah 8-7. Instinct, Scripture suggests, can perceive shifts that reason ignores. In the days of Noah, Scripture says the animals entered the ark on their own. Noah did not drive them in. They arrived when the time was right. Creation moved first, before judgment was fully revealed. This pattern appears more than once in Scripture. Nature senses change before people recognize danger. Job speaks of this same awareness embedded within creation itself. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you. Job 12-7. That is what makes these sightings difficult to dismiss. Birds do not waste energy without cause. They follow instinct shaped over countless generations. When that instinct overrides direction and destination under calm conditions, it suggests awareness beyond human perception. The question is not whether birds can behave strangely. The deeper question is why these reversals are happening now, across multiple states, beneath quiet skies. What did the birds sense in the air, or beyond it, that people could not detect? And if creation is responding early, what does that suggest about what may still be approaching, unseen, but already in motion? As the land continued to show signs of separation, another disturbance followed, this time directly beneath where people lived. In central Pennsylvania, a massive sinkhole opened inside a quiet residential neighborhood. The collapse began without warning. Within minutes, the earth opened and widened rapidly, swallowing yards and pulling pavement inward. There were no hurricanes passing through, no heavy rain, no seismic alerts. Yet the ground failed beneath homes where families had lived for generations. Residents described standing at a distance, hearing the low, muffled sound. Sidewalks split, driveways tilted, walls cracked and leaned before slipping out of sight. There was no explosion, no violent jolt, only the slow, irreversible understanding that the ground could no longer support what had been placed upon it. At nearly the same time, similar changes were unfolding in southern Utah and parts of Nevada. Slopes did not collapse in dramatic landslides. Instead, the land began to settle unevenly. Entire sections of ground descended inch by inch, damaging homes, water lines, and power infrastructure. Families were asked to leave quietly, often after dark, carrying only essential belongings, without clear explanations or visible triggers. What made these events especially unsettling was where they occurred. Several collapses appeared near mapped fault zones, yet seismic instruments recorded no earthquakes. Witnesses described the feeling as movement without impact, as if the ground had given up silently beneath them. Not a quake, not a tremor, but a quiet displacement. In Scripture, the earth is not portrayed as inert when judgment or warning approaches. The book of Numbers records a moment when the ground opened without storm or shaking. The ground under them split apart. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them. Numbers 16:31-32. There was no battle, no thunder, only sudden separation beneath those standing above it. The psalmist later describes collapse not as noise, but as loss of support. When the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Psalm 11:3. The verse assumes that the failure begins below. Likewise, Isaiah speaks of land giving way under accumulated weight. The earth staggers like a drunkard, for its transgression lies heavy upon it. Isaiah 24:20. The burden builds quietly until the ground can no longer hold. Even Job frames this awareness as something creation itself understands. He shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. Job 9-6. The pillars do not always fall at once. They loosen first. That is why these events feel different. They are not sudden disasters. They are exposures. The land is not crying out. It is yielding quietly, as if responding to a pressure long ignored. The question is no longer why the ground can collapse. Nature has always done that. The deeper question is why it is happening now, across multiple states, without warning and without sound, and whether this silent shifting beneath our feet is pointing to something else that has already begun to give way, unseen, below the surface. After the land began to split, and the ground gave way without sound, another quiet shift followed, this time in the water. Along portions of the Ohio River Valley, the upper Mississippi Basin, and stretches of the Missouri River, residents began noticing changes that did not fit familiar seasonal patterns. Rivers that had flowed steadily for decades began to look unsettled without appearing violent. Thick bands of white foam collected along the surface, clinging to bends and shorelines, stretching uninterrupted for miles. There were no nearby factories releasing visible waste, no upstream flooding reported, no sharp chemical odor rising from the water. The air smelled ordinary. The current moved at its usual pace, yet the rivers no longer looked clean. The foam lingered dense, chalky, slow to break apart, drifting downstream, but refusing to dissolve the way surface froth normally does. Water samples were taken. Routine explanations followed. Runoff, organic matter, turbulence. None fully accounted for the scale or persistence of what people were seeing. What should have dispersed within hours remained for days. What should have passed unnoticed began drawing quiet crowds, anglers standing longer than usual, farmers stopping along bridges, people watching the surface in silence. Then came the fish. In several locations, freshwater fish were seen rising toward the surface in unusual numbers. They were not floating lifeless. They were not thrashing or gasping. Instead, they hovered just beneath the waterline, suspended in stillness, their bodies barely moving, as if waiting. After a time, they slipped back below the surface, leaving no clear explanation behind. For those watching, the scene was unsettling precisely because it lacked spectacle. There was no mass die-off, no emergency response, no visible catastrophe, just a quiet interruption of normal behavior. Rivers that should have flowed unnoticed now seemed to hesitate. The pattern felt connected to what had already unfolded on land. First, the ground separated cleanly. Then birds reversed course under clear skies. After that, the earth sank silently beneath homes. Now, The rivers themselves appeared to pause, different elements responding within the same narrow window of time, all without noise, all without force. In Scripture, water is often the first element to react when hidden conditions change. Long before nations respond, rivers and springs bear witness. The prophet Amos records the Lord saying, "Shall not the land tremble for this, and everyone mourn who dwells in it, and all of it rise like the Nile, and be tossed about, and sink again?" Amos 8-8. The image is not of sudden destruction, but of water lifting what lies beneath into view. The Psalms speak of rivers responding as if aware. "The floods have lifted up, O Lord, the floods have lifted up their voice." Psalm 93-3. Water reacts before words are spoken. It reveals before judgment is named. And in Exodus, when the Nile turned and life within it surfaced, the change was not hidden. The fish in the river died, and the river stank. Exodus 7:21. What had sustained life could no longer conceal what it carried. Rivers are meant to move forward. They carry things away. They cleanse. When they begin to hold, to reveal, or to behave unnaturally, it suggests a limit has been reached, a boundary has quietly been crossed. The question, then, is not whether rivers can change. They always have. The deeper question is why these changes are appearing now alongside silent shifts in land and sky. Why is what should flow calmly now drawing attention to itself? And if the water is responding before warnings are spoken, what is it revealing that we are not yet ready to face? As signs continued to unfold across the United States, a quieter and more personal change began to appear, one that many people noticed only while walking past familiar streets and backyards. In parts of the Midwest, the Appalachian foothills, and pockets of the Northeast, clusters of young, healthy trees began shedding their leaves in the middle of the growing season. These were not aging trees or drought-stressed growth. Just days earlier, their canopies had been full and green. Then, almost at once, branches stood bare. There was no prolonged heat wave draining the soil, no visible infestation moving from tree to tree. The leaves did not yellow slowly or decay in stages. They dropped cleanly, often overnight, collecting in quiet piles beneath trunks that were still firm and alive. The trees did not bend or break. They remained upright, rooted, and standing yet suddenly exposed. For those who noticed, the sight was unsettling not because of destruction, but because of restraint. Life had not been taken. It had been uncovered. Neighbors described pausing mid-step, brushing leaves aside with their shoes, looking up to see branches stripped while nearby trees remained untouched. The moment felt deliberate, as if something had been removed while the core was intentionally left intact. In the Old Testament, leaves are often tied to covering protection, blessing, and concealment. In Genesis, when Adam and Eve first became aware of their vulnerability, they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. Genesis 3-7. Covering, in Scripture, is linked to mercy. When that covering is removed, it is not always judgment. Often, it is warning exposure before consequence. The prophets speak of this kind of uncovering as a signal. Isaiah writes, "The earth mourns and withers, the exalted of the people of the earth languish." Isaiah 24-4. The image is not annihilation, but life laid bare. Likewise, Jeremiah describes a tree that still stands, but can no longer hide its condition. "I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form, and all its cities were broken down." Jeremiah 4:23-26. What remains standing is no longer concealed. This moment feels distinct from the other signs. The land split. The ground gave way. Rivers revealed what they carried. The sea returned what it held. But here, life itself is preserved. The trees are not destroyed. They are allowed to stand without their covering. The message is quieter, yet more intimate. What makes this event especially striking is its selectivity. Not every tree was affected, not entire forests stripped bare. Instead, small clusters of healthy growth were uncovered, often beside trees that remained untouched. It was not widespread devastation. It was precise exposure. Throughout Scripture, trees represent continuity and endurance. The righteous flourish like the palm tree, Psalm 92-12. They grow slowly. They survive storms. They measure time. When such life is suddenly uncovered without being uprooted, it suggests a pause, a moment suspended between mercy and outcome. The question, then, is not why trees lose leaves. That is part of nature. The deeper question is why this is happening out of season, to healthy life, without clear cause. Why preserve what could be destroyed, yet remove what once protected it? If life can remain standing while its covering is taken away, it suggests a warning rather than an ending, an invitation to recognize vulnerability before strength is tested further. And if exposure comes first, what follows depends not on what is revealed, but on how it responds once seen. After rivers began to behave unnaturally, the warning did not remain inland. It moved outward toward the American coastline, where the sea itself began to change. Along Florida's Gulf Coast, from the Panhandle down through southwest Florida, residents watched as red tide returned with unusual strength and persistence. This was not a short-lived bloom. It settled in. It expanded. And week after week, it refused to retreat. The water darkened into heavy crimson and rust-colored bands, replacing stretches of blue and green that locals were used to seeing year-round. The smell arrived before the sight, thick, sour, unmistakable, traveling miles inland. People closed their windows in the heat. Beach roads emptied. Long familiar shorelines were suddenly avoided. Fish washed ashore in staggering numbers, lining the sand in silence. Dolphins, sea turtles, and seabirds were found gasping near the surface or stranded along the coast, trapped in water that could no longer sustain life. Red tide itself is not new to Florida. It has appeared before and eventually faded. What made this moment different was not its presence, but its endurance. The water did not clear, as expected. What should have been carried away lingered. What the sea once absorbed now returned, visible and unavoidable. In the Old Testament, the sea often represents what is hidden, restrained, and held beyond human control. When Scripture speaks of the waters changing, it is not framed as chaos, but as consequence. In Exodus, the Nile turns, and life within it surfaces. The waters were turned to blood, and the fish in the river died, and the river stank. Exodus 7:20-21. What had sustained life could no longer conceal what it carried. The prophets echo this pattern. Hosea warns of a land where the sea itself responds to accumulated weight. Therefore the land mourns, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. Hosea 4-3. The order is deliberate. What is hidden beneath the surface is revealed when limits are crossed. And the psalmist describes the sea not as raging, but as restrained until it can no longer hold. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Psalm 89-9. When restraint gives way, it signals that a boundary has been tested. This moment carries that same quiet weight. The ocean is not storming, it is responding. Not with violence, but with exposure. Boundaries that once seemed permanent are no longer holding. The The sea is showing that it has limits, and that those limits have been pressed over time. The question is no longer whether the ocean can change. History shows that it can. The deeper question is what happens when the sea can no longer cleanse itself. If what was once absorbed is now returned, what does that say about what has been carried for too long? And if the water itself is signaling consequence, how close are we to the point where there is nothing left to conceal? In recent weeks, attention has shifted to the waters off the coast of Florida, where something unexpected has begun to happen beneath the surface. Sections of the ocean floor have collapsed without warning. There were no hurricanes, no powerful waves, and no seismic activity to signal what was coming. On the surface, the sea looked stable. Below it, the foundation gave way. Authorities moved quickly to close portions of the coastline after sand began to disappear, and the seabed fractured beneath shallow waters. In some areas, the change was discovered only after boats reported sudden depth drops and sonar readings revealed voids where solid ground had been. Geologists point to Florida's unique geology as part of the explanation. The state rests on limestone, a material that slowly dissolves as water moves through it. But even experts admit something unsettling. While the process is understood, the timing is not. These failures are difficult to predict. The scale and suddenness do not follow clear patterns. This is where the event takes on deeper meaning. In Scripture, foundations represent trust and security, what everything else depends on. When foundations fail quietly, the danger has already existed long before collapse becomes visible. The psalmist asks pointedly, "If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Psalm 11-3. The verse does not describe noise or chaos, but the moment when what once supported life can no longer be relied upon. The Old Testament repeatedly portrays the sea as resting on hidden supports known only to God. Job records the Lord asking, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone?" Job 38-4. 6. Foundations are real, but unseen. When they fail, the collapse appears sudden, only because the weakening was hidden. Isaiah describes a similar pattern of silent instability. The earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken. Isaiah 24-19. Yet the breaking begins before the shaking. Separation comes first. What looks solid gives way underneath. Even the waters themselves are shown as restrained until their limits are reached. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Psalm 104-9. When boundaries shift, it signals not randomness, but consequence. An order that is no longer holding. That is what makes the situation off Florida's coast so troubling. The question is not why the ground can collapse. Nature has always done that. The deeper question is why it is collapsing now silently, beneath calm waters, while the surface still appears stable. When the foundation gives way without sound, it signals that something essential has already weakened. And if what lies beneath can fail without warning, then what appears secure above it may be resting on far less than anyone realized. This is only the beginning. What begins as a single collapse beneath the sea rarely remains isolated. Along Florida's coastline, scientists have observed that when one section of the seabed gives way, the surrounding area often becomes unstable. The failure of one hidden cavity shifts pressure outward, weakening nearby sections that may already be close to collapse. Geologists describe this as a chain reaction. One void fails. The surrounding sediment adjusts. Stress redistributes. What had been holding sometimes for decades suddenly loses balance. New sinkholes can form not because something new was added, but because support that once existed is no longer there. This is what unsettles many coastal residents. The concern is no longer about a single underwater collapse, but about spread. Communities fear that what began offshore may continue along the coastline, quietly undermining areas that appear unchanged on the surface. The land may still look solid, the water may remain calm, but beneath it, the system is no longer stable. Scripture often describes collapse in the same way, not as a lone event, but as something that multiplies once it begins. The Bible teaches that a small, hidden failure rarely stays contained. What is compromised in one place gradually affects the whole. Breakdown spreads not through noise, but through influence. In the last days, Scripture does not describe one dramatic moment that ends everything at once. Instead, it speaks of a sequence signs unfolding together, one leading into another. The warning is not found in a single collapse, but in the pattern that follows it. That is what makes these sinkholes so significant. They are not standing alone. They are revealing how interconnected everything beneath the surface truly is. If one unseen failure can destabilize an entire system, then the question becomes unavoidable. How many other weaknesses already exist beneath the world we assume is secure? As the seabed fractured and hidden caverns collapsed, something else began to surface, dark, sticky material long buried beneath layers of sand and stone. Along portions of the coast, tar-like substances appeared in the water and washed ashore in small but noticeable amounts. They did not arrive suddenly in one mass. They emerged gradually, as if released from a place that had been sealed for a very long time. Scientists believe these tar balls are not new pollutants, but ancient organic matter remnants of biological material trapped deep beneath the seabed centuries ago. Over time, pressure and sediment sealed them away, keeping them undisturbed. When the foundation below fractured, those sealed layers were breached. What had remained hidden was no longer contained. The timing matters. These substances did not rise during storms or heavy wave action. They appeared after collapse, after the structure holding them in place failed. The earth did not create something new, it released what was already there. Scripture often uses burial as a symbol. Things hidden deep represent what is unseen, unresolved, or decaying beneath the surface. In the Gospel, it is written, "Nothing is hidden that will not be revealed." The meaning is not only moral, but structural. What is buried does not stay buried forever. It remains concealed only as long as the foundation above it holds. This is why the emergence of these dark substances feels significant. When the foundation breaks, what comes out first is rarely clean. It is what has been sealed away, the residue of what was never meant to be exposed. If the earth itself begins to release what it has hidden for centuries, it raises a sobering question. What else lies beneath the surface, contained not by strength, but by fragile support, and what may be revealed next, as those foundations continue to give way? Thank you for watching.
Fascinated by the phenomenon, he recorded a video as a memory and asked a local about it. White ring high above the clouds.
Oh, blessed Jesus, look at that. How many?
Have you noticed how strange events are happening almost at the same time? Across the United States, with no rain and no alert, thick, muddy water violently erupted from the ground, ripping through streets as people ran in panic. At the very same time, the sky demanded attention. A flawless blue ring appeared overhead, perfectly formed, suspended as if time itself paused. Then a cloud emerged, shaped unmistakably like a human figure, arms stretched wide, glowing quietly in the sunlight. Moments later, fire tore through the sky, a blazing object igniting, fragmenting, then vanishing without a trace. These weren't isolated events. They happened together below our feet and above our heads. Coincidence, or a signal we were meant to notice? If something feels off, hit like and stay with me. Just moments ago, residents in Reading witnessed something no one expects to see in an ordinary American city. There was no storm warning, no heavy rain pounding the streets, no buildup. And then, without notice, the ground itself erupted. From intact pavement, thick, muddy water burst upward with force, shooting into the air like columns driven from beneath the earth. This was not water flowing downhill. It was not runoff. It rose violently, as if pressure had been building unseen, waiting for the exact moment to break through. The water was dark and heavy, saturated with sediment. It carried the color and weight of something pulled from deep underground layers, not from surface drains. Witnesses described the shock of watching normal city roads transform into unstable ground in seconds. Cars were pushed off course. Streets became impassable. People could be heard retreating, shouting warnings, stepping back as if the earth itself had become unsafe to stand on. This was not a slow failure. It was sudden, aggressive, disruptive. The kind of event that leaves people silent afterward, struggling to understand what they just saw. Officials moved quickly to calm the situation. Explanations followed: aging infrastructure, ruptured pipes, underground pressure, familiar words, logical terms. Yet even as explanations circulated, unease remained. Because infrastructure failures do not usually behave like eruptions. They leak, they crack, they sink. What happened here forced water upward, violently, as though something below had been released all at once. That distinction matters. In Scripture, when catastrophic water events are described, the focus is not only on rain from above. In the account of Noah's flood, Genesis records something far more unsettling. The fountains of the great deep were broken up. Judgment did not begin solely with clouds opening. It began with the earth itself failing from below. That detail is often overlooked, but it changes the picture entirely. Water rising from beneath speaks of instability, where people assume permanence. Roads are built on the belief that the ground will hold. Cities expand on the assumption that what lies below is solid, predictable, and controlled. When that assumption fails, it shakes more than infrastructure. It shakes confidence. The events in Reading force an uncomfortable question into the open. If water can suddenly surge upward from unseen depths, what else lies beneath our systems, our cities, our sense of security? And how much pressure is building out of sight? This was not rain overwhelming drains. This was the ground asserting itself without warning. Scripture consistently uses the earth's behavior as a sign not to provoke panic, but to provoke awareness. When foundations tremble or break open, the message is not merely physical, it is symbolic. It reminds people that stability is not guaranteed simply because yesterday felt normal. When water rises from below instead of falling from above, it signals that something foundational has shifted. And once foundations begin to move, events rarely remain isolated. While the ground was violently breaking open below, the story did not remain confined to the streets. Almost at the same time, attention was drawn upward, far above the chaos unfolding on the Earth's surface. As if the disturbance below was being mirrored above, something unusual appeared in the sky that demanded explanation. Passengers aboard a commercial flight captured footage of a perfectly defined blue circle suspended among the clouds. It was not faint. It was not distorted. It was sharply outlined, vivid in color, and unmistakably circular. Against the shifting white and gray of surrounding cloud layers, this formation stood apart, unnaturally precise, visually isolated, and impossible to ignore. Unlike ordinary cloud patterns, the blue circle did not drift with the wind. It did not stretch, thin out, or dissolve as clouds normally do. It remained still, fixed, held in place, as if anchored. While nearby clouds shifted and flowed, this formation maintained its structure, giving the unsettling impression of something intentional rather than atmospheric. Observers struggled to describe what they were seeing. Many said it resembled an opening like a doorway or gate suspended in the heavens. Others compared it to a lens or aperture, as though the sky itself had been punctured for a brief moment. What unsettled viewers most was not its color or shape, but its behavior. The sky was moving. The circle was not. That contrast matters. In the same way, the eruption of water from the ground defied expectations of how infrastructure fails, this formation defied expectations of how clouds behave. Both events challenged what people assume is stable, predictable, and understood. Below, the earth forced its way upward. Above, the heavens appeared to hold something open. Biblical texts frequently describe moments when the heavens were opened, before periods of warning, revelation, or transition. These moments were not described as permanent changes, but as brief openings, windows through which humanity was allowed to glimpse something beyond the ordinary flow of time and nature. That language is striking when placed beside modern footage of a perfectly shaped opening in the sky. Scripture often presents signs in layers, the earth responding, the sky responding, and humanity standing in between, forced to interpret, forced to choose whether to dismiss or to pay attention. Rarely are warnings isolated to one realm. When both below and above react, the message becomes harder to ignore. This raises a sobering question. If the ground beneath our feet is breaking open, while the sky above displays signs that resist natural explanation, are we witnessing coincidence or coordination? Are these simply rare anomalies captured at the same time, or signals aligned to draw attention from both directions at once? Moments like this are not meant to entertain, they are meant to awaken. Stay with me, because what appeared next in the sky only deepens the pattern and the urgency. Not long after the blue circle faded from view, another image began to circulate, one that carried a very different weight. This time, it was not geometry or color that drew attention, but form. A cloud formation appeared that bore a striking resemblance to a human figure, upright and unmistakable in posture. The shape was not abstract. A head-like outline was visible. A torso seemed defined. Arms appeared extended outward, not raised in motion, but open still, deliberate, and balanced. What unsettled many viewers was not how dramatic it looked, but how recognizable it felt. The human mind searches for patterns, yet this shape required little imagination to perceive. Surrounding the figure was a soft, golden glow. It was not intense or blinding. There was no flash, no burst of light, no spectacle demanding fear. Instead, the glow appeared calm, almost gentle, as if illuminating the figure without overwhelming the sky around it. The clouds did not churn violently. The scene did not erupt into chaos. It simply appeared. Those who witnessed it did not react with panic. There were no screams, no frantic movements. Instead, many stood still. Some filmed silently. Others lowered their phones altogether, as if recording suddenly felt insufficient. The dominant reaction was quiet attention, the kind that happens when people sense meaning but struggle to articulate it. Throughout the Bible, clouds are repeatedly linked with divine presence, guidance, and authority. From the pillar of cloud that led Israel through the wilderness, to the cloud that descended upon Mount Sinai, to the cloud that overshadowed Jesus at the Transfiguration, clouds are portrayed not as random backdrops, but as vehicles of revelation. They conceal and reveal at the same time. What makes this image unsettling is not that it demanded belief. It did not. It made no announcement. It issued no threat. It arrived without instruction and faded without explanation. Yet its presence lingered longer than more dramatic sights often do. There was no spectacle to debate, only an image that quietly impressed itself upon memory. Unlike events that shock through violence or destruction, this moment unsettled through restraint. It did not force interpretation. It invited reflection. That difference sets it apart. In times of relative calm, such imagery might be dismissed as coincidence, illusion, or imagination. But context matters. This appearance came amid growing global unrest, political instability, environmental disruption, social fracture, and widespread anxiety. When foundations feel unstable, people become more sensitive to symbols that suggest authority, oversight, or presence beyond human control. The question left behind is not whether this image proves anything.
We're going to start with intense flooding on the West Coast.
Something unusual is unfolding across the United States tonight. In California, relentless rain has transformed entire neighborhoods into moving rivers, sweeping away cars and flooding homes within minutes. While the West battles water, the Midwest faces a different crisis as sudden ground fissures open across long stretches of farmland. Farther north, Alaska is trapped beneath record-breaking snow that refuses to stop. And in several coastal states, animals are abandoning familiar routes as if sensing something humans cannot. What is disturbing millions is not one disaster, but how closely these events are unfolding together. When patterns align this rapidly, they demand attention. Before we continue, like this video, subscribe, and stay with us. Along the California coastline, the rain did something many people had never witnessed in their lifetime. What began as steady rainfall suddenly intensified into a relentless torrent, overwhelming storm drains, and turning entire streets into fast-moving rivers. Water pushed through neighborhoods with a force that felt unnatural, sweeping cars off highways and flooding homes in minutes. This was not a storm passing by. It was water invading places people believed were protected. What made the flooding even more disturbing was the scale. This was not one city or one county facing trouble. From Northern California to Los Angeles to San Diego, multiple regions were engulfed simultaneously. The timing alone made it difficult to dismiss as coincidence. It felt as if a system meant to manage water had failed everywhere at once. As the water rose, the land gave way. Hillsides, saturated beyond capacity, collapsed without warning. Mud and debris surged downhill, burying roads under feet of soil. Bridges weakened, culverts overflowed, and entire blocks became isolated as access routes disappeared. These failures did not unfold gradually. One collapse triggered another in a rapid, unstoppable chain reaction. Engineers later confirmed what many feared. The infrastructure did not fail because of the rain. The rain exposed weaknesses that had been building long before anyone noticed. Systems designed decades ago were confronted by conditions far beyond their intended limits. Homes once considered secure became vulnerable. Streets designed to handle seasonal storms were overtaken. Flood control maps no longer matched reality. The reliability people trusted for years dissolved under the sheer volume and speed of the water. But the most alarming moment came when the flood crossed into daily life. Schools, shopping districts, and residential neighborhoods were submerged. Entire communities in San Jose, Ventura, Santa Barbara, Sacramento, and Los Angeles County were forced into sudden evacuations. Place that had handled countless storms before now offered no protection at all. The fear did not come only from the destruction. It came from the realization that places labeled safe were safe only under old conditions, conditions that no longer exist. Scripture warned of moments like this, describing a time when the sea and the waves will roar. In biblical language, this does not refer only to oceans, but to waters, crossing boundaries, physical, structural, and symbolic. When water moves where it should not, it is portrayed not as chaos, but as a signal that a greater shift is underway. So, the question becomes unavoidable. If water can claim this much ground this quickly, what else may be about to shift next? Across the Midwest, the ground did something no one expected. At first, residents noticed thin, harmless-looking cracks weaving across fields' lines so straight they seemed unnatural. Local officials assumed the same things they always do: soil saturation, routine subsidence, ordinary erosion. But within hours, the cracks widened. Straight lines became deep ruptures, and what began as inches opened into feet, stretching across farmland with disturbing precision. When drone footage lowered cameras and lighting equipment into it, something even more unsettling was captured. The fissures did not form erratically, the way broken ground usually behaves. Instead, they ran in continuous, unbroken paths across multiple properties. Some stretched for hundreds of yards, cutting through fields, roads, and fence lines without deviation, like the land was being pulled apart from underneath rather than collapsing from above. But the deeper shock came when geologists examined the exposed layers beneath the split earth. The interior walls of the fissures were unusually smooth in places, not jagged or shattered as typical soil breaks would be. Certain sections appeared shaped, almost carved, with clean, repeating angles that defied the randomness of natural erosion. And embedded within those walls were markings patterns in the stone that did not match plow marks, machinery damage, or any known geological texture. Experts noted that the symbols, if they could even be called symbols, did not resemble Native American petroglyphs, settler inscriptions, mining tools, or structural reinforcement. They were too consistent, too deliberate, too deep in the layers of earth to be modern. Equally unsettling was the depth at which these patterns existed. They were found meters below the surface, sealed in compacted layers that should have remained untouched for centuries. There were no tunnels, no entrances, no evidence of prior excavation. Everything about the formation suggested that whatever these markings were, they were never meant to be seen, not by this generation, and perhaps not by any. In Scripture, hidden things surfacing is rarely described as chance. Sealed writings, buried chambers, and concealed signs appear during moments of transition, revealed only when the time is right. Daniel speaks of words sealed until the end. Isaiah speaks of deep things brought to light. The act of revealing is not random, it is timed. Which forces an uncomfortable question. If the ground opened now, then why now? What triggered this unveiling? As the Midwest fissures widen and expose what was hidden for so long, another change was already unfolding farther north. This time, not through collapse or exposure, but through a slow, silent pressure. Before we move on, if you sense something deeper is happening, comment, "I'm watching," because awareness often comes before understanding. Across southern and central Alaska, snow did not arrive in storms or waves. It simply never stopped. Day after day, dense, moisture-heavy snow fell in volumes locals had never experienced. Driveways, shoveled before sunrise, were buried again by mid-morning. Roads cleared at dawn vanished under new white blankets by noon. What residents realized quickly was chilling. This was not a storm passing through. This was accumulation without pause. The weight built faster than communities could respond. Roofs bowed under the burden. Trees bent until they snapped, dragging power lines down with them. Emergency crews struggled to reach neighborhoods cut off by towering snowbanks. In Juneau, snowfall came in feet, not inches, loading rooftops and pushing mountain slopes to their limits. Avalanche warnings were issued near densely populated areas, forcing families to evacuate with little notice. Anchorage faced a different but equally dangerous challenge. Snowbanks climbed past 10 feet, narrowing streets into icy corridors. Ambulances and fire trucks had to navigate routes carved between walls of compacted ice. Response times slowed not from lack of effort, but from physical impossibility. And then came the cold. Temperatures plunged toward -40 degrees, a level where mistakes do not scream, they erase quietly. Vehicles failed. Pipes burst. Heaters faltered. Survival shifted from infrastructure to endurance. Neighbors helped neighbors, checking vents, clearing snow, sharing heat, watching for carbon monoxide buildup. Meteorologists pointed to persistent atmospheric patterns, saying the jet stream had locked in place, trapping moisture and cold over the region. Their explanations were technical, but Scripture described this kind of moment long before satellite imagery existed. In Job 37:6, it is written, "For to the snow he says, fall on the earth." The message is not that snow is random. In the Bible, prolonged pressure is not a sign of chaos, but of exposure. Now, this extreme moment is not what is unsettling, but the pattern. No recovery window, no pause, no letting up, just pressure. And when nature applies pressure at this scale, the question becomes unavoidable. And when the snow does not stop falling, it often means another kind of pressure is already building. This time, it wasn't the sky or the land responding. It was the animals. At first, the changes were subtle. Fishermen along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts noticed pods of dolphins migrating weeks ahead of schedule. Seabirds abandoned feeding zones they had used for generations. Whales surfaced farther inland, wandering into narrow bays they normally avoided. There were no storms pushing them, no red tide, no sonar disruption, just a quiet shift instinct without explanation. On land, farmers across multiple states reported something even more unsettling. Cattle refused to follow familiar paths. Herds stopped abruptly in open fields, as if sensing an unseen boundary. Some stood motionless for hours, ignoring food, routine, and human command. There was no panic, no stampede. Instead, the animals acted with a strange, calm certainty, as though they were responding to something humans could not yet measure. In the forests, the pattern deepened. Deer migrated early. Birds left nesting grounds out of season. Small mammals moved downslope, clustering in unusual areas. These were not chaotic reactions to noise or predators. They followed a rhythm across species and regions, appearing in a narrow window of time. Different animals, different habitats, the same instinct. Biologists offered explanations: changes in magnetic fields, atmospheric pressure shifts, and subtle vibrations in the ground that animals can detect long before humans notice them. Their theories were possible, but incomplete. The scale and timing did not fit ordinary disruptions. What unsettled observers most was the unity of the response. Not one species, not one region, but many, simultaneously, across thousands of miles. This is where Scripture speaks with striking clarity. In Job 12:7, it is written, "Ask the beasts, and they will teach you." The verse does not portray animals as primitive or chaotic. It presents them as witnesses, creatures that respond to creation before humans understand the cause. Throughout the Bible, animals often react first when events of significance are unfolding. They sense pressure beneath the earth.
We begin with the dangerous weather from coast to coast.
Oh my gosh. I'm going back.
Everything's gone. It's all gone.
It's okay.
Stop, I'm recording.
Across America, extreme and unsettling events are unfolding, leaving millions in fear as the ordinary begins to fall apart.
In Florida, the sky turned hostile, raining down ice that sounded like judgment drums. At the same time, the arteries of Indiana froze, blocking the nation's lifeline in its tracks. And deep beneath Utah, the cracking ground erased living things near Springdale and revealed warnings carved in stone. These events did not unfold one by one. They remained together at the same narrow time. Is this coincidence or a pattern too precise to ignore? If you feel the shift, if you hear the warning in the wind, you are not alone. Subscribe and like this video to stay alert, because the signs are no longer whispering. They are shouting. In Florida, the atmosphere darkened with unsettling speed. Thick, low-hanging clouds swallowed the sky, turning daylight dim and heavy. Winds intensified rapidly, driving sheets of rain that tore through streets and neighborhoods, carrying debris in their wake. Palm trees bent violently, high-rise buildings groaned under the pressure, and entire blocks seemed to sway as if caught in an uncontained tide. Gusts tore through open spaces, lifting loose objects and scattering them across roads and sidewalks. Crowds struggled to remain upright. Umbrellas snapped and were ripped from hands. What little people tried to hold on to was quickly torn away by the force of the storm. Along major roads, power lines snapped and collapsed, plunging neighborhoods into sudden darkness. Traffic lights failed. Large billboards and commercial signs were torn from their frames, sailing through the air like fallen leaves before crashing down onto streets and parking lots. In residential areas, families rushed indoors, barricading windows and doors as rain battered rooftops relentlessly. Inside homes, people huddled together, anxious for the safety of loved ones and fearful of what the storm might still bring. Then, beneath the deepening sky over Florida, the storm took a more dangerous turn. Dense, dark cloud formations thickened overhead, signaling the arrival of hail. The air grew cold, heavy, and oppressive. Raindrops hardened into ice. Small stones began to fall, striking roofs, vehicles, and pavement with sharp, metallic impacts that echoed through neighborhoods. Though some were no larger than snowballs, they fell with brutal force, colder, faster, and more punishing. Windows shattered. Roof shingles cracked. Cars parked along streets were pocked and dented within minutes. In agricultural areas, fields and gardens took the brunt of the assault. Fragile branches snapped. Unripe fruit was destroyed where it hung. Crops meant for harvest were stripped away in moments, delivering severe blows to local farmers and small agricultural operations. Residents caught outdoors, scrambled for shelter, shielding themselves from the barrage of frozen stones. The hail continued to fall, piling up along roadsides and lawns, coating the ground in an unnatural white layer resembling snow, but far denser and colder. Streets became slick and hazardous. Travel turned treacherous as vehicles slid and visibility dropped. In rural communities and small towns, families fought to protect livestock and essential belongings. Cattle, poultry, and other animals stood exposed, distressed by the cold, wind, and noise. Many went unfed and unprotected for hours, as conditions made movement dangerous. Emergency responders and state agencies mobilized quickly, navigating flooded roads and debris-filled highways to reach stranded residents. Despite limited visibility and hazardous conditions, rescue teams pressed forward, offering aid wherever possible. The aftermath revealed the scale of the damage. Storms, flooding, and hail across Florida resulted in widespread losses. Homes were damaged or destroyed. Vehicles were rendered unusable. Some residents were injured, others displaced. Infrastructure suffered heavily, roads washed out, bridges weakened, and water and electrical systems knocked offline, cutting off essential services to entire communities. The agricultural sector endured significant losses as well. Flooded land and destroyed crops led to reduced yields and economic strain, particularly for small farmers and rural families. Beyond immediate damage, environmental consequences followed. Polluted waterways, disrupted ecosystems, and long-term threats to wildlife and local biodiversity effects that will linger well beyond the storm itself. For many, it was just another historic storm, added to a growing list of disasters in Florida. But when a single state begins to see wind, flood, and hail tearing through homes, fields, and power lines all at once, the question changes. It is no longer only about how strong the storm was, but why now? Why such precision? Scripture describes a world that groans, like a creation in labor, straining under the weight of what humanity has built and believed. It speaks of days when the powers of the heaven will be shaken, when creation will not just groan, but reveal, when storms begin to strike not only one region, but from the oceans to the rivers, from the ground to the heavens. Some see only extreme weather. Others see a pattern that sounds uncomfortably close to what was written long ago. No one can say with absolute certainty which storm marks the moment. But history and scripture suggest that when chaos gives way to clarity, when destruction pauses and attention is drawn to a single place, the pattern changes. And shortly after the storms subsided, that change became impossible to ignore. What happened in the Gulf Coast was just the opening act. In the middle of a quiet Oregon forest at night, where only the wind moved through the trees and distant ridgelines faded into darkness, a monitoring satellite recorded something wholly unexpected. A perfect column of light appeared without warning, descending straight down into the forest clearing like a shaft drawn between sky and earth. The light formed a near-perfect circle on the ground, luminous and contained, remaining in place for just over a minute, some estimates say 60 seconds, others closer to 90, before vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. When local responders later reached the site, the scene offered more questions than answers. The ground within the circle was slightly warm to the touch, but the surrounding forest showed no damage. Leaves were intact. Branches were unscorched. There was no sign of fire, no charring, no smoke residue. The light had not burned or spread. It had simply illuminated and then withdrawn. Most striking of all, the circle it left behind was precise, its boundary clean and unbroken, as if deliberately marked. Environmental scientists and atmospheric specialists struggled to explain what had occurred. There was no lightning activity, no electrical storm, no known human source. No equipment failures were reported in the area. The event seemed to exist only in that brief window, appearing and disappearing without a trace. But when those who know scriptures viewed through a biblical lens, the imagery feels familiar. In Exodus 3-2, God appears in fire that does not consume, a presence revealed without destruction. Here, too, the light did not harm. It did not scorch the forest or alter the land. It arrived, shone with unmistakable clarity, and then receded, leaving the place changed not by damage, but by attention. Even those who dismissed divine intervention admitted privately that the alignment of events felt uncanny, as though orchestrated by a hand beyond human reach. For many believers, the meaning was immediate and terrifying. In Ezekiel 1, the prophet describes radiant light encircled within itself, surrounding divine glory, a symbol not of chaos, but of holiness and authority. From this perspective, the Oregon column of light becomes something more than an anomaly. It reads as a signal of illumination rather than judgment, a moment in which heaven briefly touched the earth without force. What deepens the significance is its timing. The light appeared only days after disturbances elsewhere, after the ground had shifted, after the land had spoken. First, the earth moved. Then, the light descended. Each event arrived suddenly, without a clear natural cause, unfolding as if in sequence, rather than isolation. Layer by layer, creation seemed to be responding. Not all at once, but deliberately, as though preparing the way for what was still to come. In the outskirts of Chicago, as a powerful winter storm gathered strength, weather radar systems worked continuously to track its movement across the region. But while reviewing the data, technicians noticed something they could not easily categorize. Forming within the heart of the storm was a distinct human-shaped figure, crowned with what appeared to be a radiant circlet, standing clearly against the surrounding mass of snow and cloud. The shape was immense, spanning several miles, yet its outline was sharply defined, captured not by imagination, but by radar itself. As the image appeared on screens, people on the ground sensed a sudden shift. The wind changed direction without warning, its low, resonant sound carrying across streets and frozen avenues. The noise did not resemble ordinary gusts or mechanical failure. Many described it as solemn, almost ceremonial, lasting less than a minute before fading back into the storm. Phones were raised. Recordings spread quickly as snow intensified and visibility dropped. Reaction across Chicago surged through social media within minutes. Live streams and first-hand accounts described the moment as unsettling and awe-filled, as if the storm briefly revealed something more than weather. Some said it felt like being observed. Others spoke of a presence silent, unmoving, outlined in light and shadow within the snowfall. Not thunder, not machinery, but something that felt deliberate. Within the framework of Scripture, the imagery carries familiar weight. In Revelation, crowned figures appear as messengers and rulers, not emerging from calm skies, but often amid upheaval and judgment. In Daniel and Isaiah, radiant beings are described clothed in light, appearing at moments of transition, when nations are weighed and times begin to shift. Seen through that lens, the crowned figure over Chicago becomes more than a visual anomaly. It resembles a herald, a sign that arrives not to explain itself, but to mark a moment. In the Bible, such figures do not appear casually. They signal movement decisions being made beyond human sight. If the earth spoke through shaking ground, if fire and light marked the land elsewhere, then now the frozen sky over the Midwest has joined the sequence. The image over Chicago is not merely striking or terrifying. It is a reminder. Like the trumpet calls of ancient times, it seems to say that a boundary has been crossed. Times are changing, and the storm was not finished speaking. In Indiana, the storm shut a nation's artery. A massive winter system surged across the region, burying highways, rail lines, and distribution corridors beneath thick, wind-driven snowfall. Interstates that once carried food, fuel, and freight across the country fell silent. Tractor trailers jackknifed and stalled, frozen in place. Trains slowed, then stopped. Airports grounded flights, stranding travelers, and halting the steady flow that keeps distant cities connected. Whiteout conditions erased familiar landmarks. Winds howled across open plains, piling snow into walls that swallowed vehicles and closed rural roads. Temperatures plunged, turning exposure into a threat within minutes. Emergency crews worked around the clock, battling exhaustion and limited visibility as they tried to reopen routes that kept sealing shut behind them. Communities felt the impact almost immediately. Deliveries were delayed. Shelves thinned. Power outages left homes dark and cold as ice-laden lines sagged and failed. For those living along the storm's path, the danger was not abstract. It was measured in hours without heat, in roads that could not be reached, in help that could not arrive. What unfolded in Indiana revealed yet another dimension of the same pattern. When the atmosphere locks down movement, whether through water, mud, or snow, the systems built to sustain modern life stall with it. The storm did not need to destroy cities to disrupt the nation. It only had to stop the flow. The Bible speaks of a time when great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences would be joined by fearful events and great signs from heaven.